Welcome, everybody. I appreciate you taking the time to go through this micro learning class with us. We're kind of putting together the building blocks of the economics of our business in terms of where we want to land if we're going to be in various disciplines. And within each discipline, we have various ways we can sell our products and services. If we're going to do those things, how much money should we be making? How do we compare to our peers in the industry in terms of where we land? Are we the best in the industry, or are we the worst, right? Among our peers. We are working our way through this. And when I say building blocks, you notice that we kind of started with kind of the simplest of the businesses that we're in. Yeah, we started with the simpler of the businesses, and I'm not going to go through our whole agenda for the next 6-8 weeks, but we started with talking about the economics in general, what we're trying to accomplish with this. We went into how we look at transactional revenues, simple premise-based voice transactions, larger surveillance installations where we include the bundle of equipment and installation in that single price. And how do we work with that? Well, we look at the pricing. We want to make a 20% contribution. We have to put together a product that's around a 2.2 on average to get there. We also have to manage our installation time, which is roughly 6 hours per $1,000 of equipment. So we have some metrics that we're building in, and I think you're seeing our philosophy as to how we look at the business. We try to look at this extremely simply and come down with the core one or two metrics that really drives our profitability with whatever it is we sell. Well, last week we got into bundling partner plans or maintenance agreements with these transactional revenues in order to increase that. Talked about various ways that we can sell a maintenance agreement. We can sell it under CTAP, which is where it is bundled in with a lease in order to maximize that revenue and be more profitable than if we were to just sell the product, install the product, and then move on and just wait for the service call to ring us up when they need some sort of service on that product. So now we're going to move into this week's class, and this week is kind of a lot to discuss. We're breaking it up over two classes. So this one, we're going to start talking about these hourly labor and just the sales of standalone equipment. And we'll finish it up on the next class, which will be the Thursday after Thanksgiving. There's quite a bit of nuance to this one. And ideally, I'd like you guys to be prepared to come off of mute, because I'm going to ask you guys to share with me kind of your current setup with how you bill hourly rates and things like that. Probably call on you, and I'll give you a chance to come off of mute just to answer questions, because I think we do want to get a little bit more discussion involved as we move into some of these a little bit more complex topics. We're talking about maximizing hourly labor in our standalone equipment sales. We want to make sure that when we're billing time by the hour, whatever we're billing it for, we're doing it correctly, and we're finding ways to maximize our profitability like we would on anything else. Same thing goes for standalone equipment. And what do I mean by standalone equipment? Well, we talked about the bundled equipment with the installation, where we sell, let's say, a surveillance system with the install for a fixed price. We also may sell large phone, telephony, premise installations. We're selling the equipment and we're installing it, configuring it, getting it in the wall for that fixed price. What we're talking about with standalone equipment sales is kind of the ad hoc, just we're selling pure hardware, and anything labor related is sold separately. This is a big part of our business, because even if we're really gaming towards getting people on some sort of recurring revenue, we're trying to bring on, let's say, IT customers onto a managed services program. We're trying to bring on our voice customers onto either a partnering plan or a hosted solution where it's recurring and the service is included. But we still typically have quite a bit of break fix in those industries with some of our members. We also have project labor. If we're bringing on an IT customer, we're going to have project labor. We're going to talk about project labor and remediation billing. This is kind of what they say is the T in T&M, time and materials billing. That just doesn't apply only to break fix type of scenarios, but it's also when we have an IT customer, let's say they need a project, they need network stabilization to happen, they need to replace servers, they need new PCs. Typically, that work is not included. We bill that separately in order to bring that customer online. As companies grow, they need new employees added to their MSP bundle, but they might need additional PCs that have to be spun up, all the installations, all of the work that goes into doing that. We're still going to do a lot of hourly billing, even if we're trying to avoid kind of any kind of break fix model. And we still do have a lot of folks in the IT business who have customers that sell time by the hour because that's the way those customers have been for a while. If you're just getting into IT, you're typically moving into MSP only, but you're still going to have time by the hour you have to bill. And what we want to do is we want to maximize that. We're talking about all billable project labor and any billable remediation where we're fixing anything. We're billing it by the hour. It doesn't matter. We talked about all disciplines, whether this is IT, voice, surveillance, office equipment. If we're selling time by the hour, the metrics are the same. How much are we charging for that hour? How much does it cost for our technician and the support of that technician? And those are true whether we're in IT, voice, or anything else. If we're baking a birthday cake, by the hour, it's still pretty much the same economic trigger points into what our costs are and how we deliver that. It doesn't matter what we're doing. It matters it doesn't matter what technology we're in. Let's put it that way. I want to ask a quick question of you guys here. Let's see, maybe I'll start with Mauricio. Mauricio, what is your billable hourly rate that you charge when you're doing any kind of hourly billing? What's your rate?
125 plus travel time.
Okay, so you bill travel time. It's variable travel time in terms of just whatever it takes from the time that they leave the office?
Well, it's variable, but it doesn't exceed $25.
Okay, fair enough. So you have a trip charge plus $125 an hour. Courtney, what do you do over at Comtech? You're on mute.
We actually just raised our rates to 180 an hour.
Okay.
We have a trip charge, I guess it's 270 now, that includes any travel, doesn't matter how long, and the first half hour on site.
Okay. So you get, that's for how far away is that? Well beyond.
As long as it's within our normal service area. So it could be 5 minutes or an hour, it doesn't matter. It's accounting for an hour of travel, the math does.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's see, Penny, what do you charge per hour? We know it's Canadian dollars, so it's funny money, but we'll try to figure it out.
So we charge 120 an hour, and then we charge in town a $25 truck fee, and then out of town we base it on the kilometers, just because our geographical range is so huge. It's just easier for us to do it that way.
Just door to door billing for the time. Okay,
that's right.
Gotcha. So this is good to hear. What I've gotten out of this conversation so far is that Mauricio at 125 and Courtney at 180, that must mean that Comtech, their technicians are much more qualified, much more efficient, and they obviously have to be a lot better since they're getting another $55 an hour. Is that right, Mauricio? Now you're on mute.
Yeah, I think so. I'm gonna learn from her technician so we can charge more.
It's taken a long time for me to get us to increase to this. We were, I think, 140 when I started and stayed at that for a while. Well, right. We had different rates for remote at the time, 120 for remote and then 140 on site, and we've slowly increased.
Right.
So what I experienced on the copier side, that's where I come from. My life is the copier side, is that as we picked up more service contracts in the copier world, our hourly service rate went up. We weren't as interested as running those calls as taking care of our current base, but welcome new business, and we did funny things. So that's the trend that happened in my business in the copier side. So at the beginning, we're more competitive because we want a big opportunity to be in front of the customer.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. And there's a lot of those trade-offs that happen in terms of how we're approaching customers, especially if we're bringing on an MSP customer. There's times we strategically choose not to maximize, let's say, the revenue on some project work because we know we're going to get the managed services work. And I'm sure it's same in the copier world. Just so I'm making sure I touch everybody here, Mark Stokes, what's your
Hi, everyone.
billing rate?
We bill 175 an hour.
Okay. See who else is here. Blake, what about you guys over at Kelly?
We bill at 150 an hour for on-site
Okay.
rate.
Let's see, Bonnie. Can you tell us what UTEC's billable rate is? If you're there?
Yeah, I can't. I'm sorry. I don't know.
That's quite all right. Let's see, or actually, well, I already got yours. Fair enough, because you're with PCS as well. Okay. When we look at this, sometimes we have long-term projects that take a lot of time. We have short projects where it's spinning up a single PC and we bill for an hour or two. All of these concepts really are going to apply to any scenario, and they can certainly help us whether we're billing for remediation or we're billing for project work. How we do that is really affected by some of these concepts we're going to talk about. And the important thing to know, reason why I wanted everybody to throw out what their billable rate is because when you look at it, I'm kind of giving Mauricio a little bit of a hard time, but there's absolutely no difference really, all in all, in the technicians from one to another. We found that there's very little difference in rates in Miami versus rates in Chicago. Rates in Chicago versus a very, very rural area in Des Moines. We have people that can get higher rates, whether it's rural, whether it's urban. Everybody thinks that the grass is greener. It's like, my environment is different than everybody else's. I can't get $150 an hour. Our going rate where I live is 120. And what we find is that when we ask for the additional rate, or we incrementally increase the hourly rates every year or so by small dollars, we typically see no pushback. We have a whole concept on this I'll talk a little bit more about, the methodology of making sure that we are not leaving our rates to sit. I've had folks come into my financial class when we meet in person. We'll all go around the exact same way, and we'll have somebody that comes up and says, well, my rates are only $85 because that's all I can get in my market. And then I'll typically be able to point to 3 people in the room who had $80, $100 rates 3-4 years ago, and that have now raised those rates. Raising rates occasionally is certainly something we always talk about. If I ask somebody, how long has it been since you raised your rates? And they say, oh gosh, 5-6 years. Obviously, everything else we're doing here is going up. We're paying our technicians more. We have to possibly pay more to put gas in the vehicles. All of our services that we pay for typically go up periodically. Look at Netflix, raises it $1 or $2, it seems like every year for these recurring services that we get. We need to keep up with that. We don't need to increase our rates by $50 an hour, but if we were to do small periodic increases, and the methodology of doing that without frustrating your customers is always a good thing to revisit. The sales of our labor, manpower by the hour, doesn't matter what it is, IT, voice, surveillance, print, should contribute, again, contribution, amount of money we have left over before we pay any overheads, after our cost of goods, after our sales expenses is our contribution. That should be about 40%. The way this works here, my typical little spreadsheet here is if we have our sales price is 100% of whatever our rate is, the cost of goods should be about 50%. What does that include? The cost of goods to provide that hour of labor is not just the $25 or $35 or $22 an hour we pay the technician. We say a fully loaded labor rate, by our definition, is not just the technician plus their taxes and benefits. It is the technicians, it's the dispatcher, project management who participates, an operations manager who obviously costs money, the labor load on all of those people, not just the technicians, but the support personnel, and then the other things that support the operations department, your vehicles, the technician perks and training we may pay for, and all of those things. So when we really add it all up to provide an hour of labor, the cost of the ops department typically is about 50% gross margins. Then we have a sales expense, and the sales expense typically runs about 10%. If you recall, when we did the fixed price contracts with telephony and surveillance, where we're including labor, remember that we had about 18% gross sales cost, including the commissions, the full sales department, sales management, your marketing, advertising, all that stuff. And we have the whole sales department that ran up to about 18%, but it's only 10 here. And the reason for that, typically we're doing projects that we'll commission on, but we'll also have some break fix calls that come in where people call us up for maybe not on any kind of a service plan and they want us to do something for them. And if it comes in like that, there's typically some measure of house accounts or call-ins that we really wouldn't pay a commission on. We typically don't see the sales burden, what we typically would see in the other fixed price contract business. The net of that, very simply, just comes to 40 points. How do we get the contribution up to 40%? And there's quite a few topics here we want to talk about. The two you probably think of most of would be how much we're billing and what our rate is. Depending on how far we get today, we will talk about just that rate, how we manage the rate. If my rate's 100, should it be 120? If it's 150, should it be higher than that? Depending on my cost, we have to have the right rates. We will get into that, and I'm not sure if we'll touch on it today, but it may be something we push to the next one because I want to talk about something else a little bit today, and I'll show you what that is in a moment. When we talk about revenue that's getting billed by the hour, what we can control, what I mentioned is we typically think of this, well, we can control what rate we charge. How do we make more money? Well, we make more money if we go from, Mauricio goes from 120 to 130. Obviously, that's a nice increase, even though it only doesn't seem like much. That's a solid 7-8% increase in revenue for the same hour of labor that he has the same cost on. The other thing that typically comes to mind is the cost of our technicians. Can we control that? Maybe, maybe not. Typically, we hire people at a rate that we offer to pay them and they accept it. That's typically the right rate to pay someone. And I don't know if you can really control it because you do have to pay the folks. You can't cut their pay for sure. You can't go across and say, hey, we need to make more money on T&M. We're not going to go shave $1 an hour off of everybody's pay, but we can control how we manage them and how efficient they are. The cost of the technicians is important, but not as much as you might think. But when it comes to hourly revenue, really the answer is this here that we want to do. We want to maximize revenue because we know we're going to spend the same amount on the technicians, on the labor load, on the benefits for those technicians, the support personnel, all of the technician perks training and vehicle costs. That's all really going to stay the same. So what we find is if we can maximize the earned revenue, that really changes our profitability by a lot because that cost stays the same. It's kind of like Nirvana. The cost stays the same. We get an extra $10 an hour. Where does that $10 go? It goes right to the bottom line. I mean, we don't have increased costs because we charge $10 more an hour. We are going to talk about the specific rate. We will talk about managing technicians in a manner that is efficient and how we measure those technicians. That might end up rolling into next week's class because I don't think there's any way we could talk about this topic in 1 hour, but we will get there. What do I want to start with? I want to start with this. Here's a change, simple change that will create 67%, 2/3 more money in your pocket, and it's 100% profit after you pay all the technicians and the cost of delivering hourly service. Let's just use a quick example here. let's say it's an IT customer. IT customer says, hey, I got 3 new PCs that they need to spin up and install the software, all the things that we typically do. Normally, that hour and a half per, let's say, computer, and it might be 2, it might be 2.5, who knows, but what the actual time we think it's going to take is about an hour and a half per PC. And we are going to bill the customer hourly for that time. If we're going to bill, let's say, I'm just going to use 150 as I think that's about the average of what we heard here today. $150 an hour times 4.5 hours is going to be about $675. When we add up all the costs, that comes to about $405. I said contribution before overhead should be about 40%. On those 3 hours, we're going to gross contribution of $270. And for this example, I want to actually throw in our overhead estimate, and I want to look at profit. Profit in best case scenario runs about 15%. Yours might be higher, but that's okay. Let's assume that we're in best case scenario time, and about 15% of that is going to run to overhead. Net profit, EBITDA, on that hour of labor, when we look at all the hours we sell over the year and all the costs to support those folks, is going to run about 25%. If we're doing everything right, we have the right pricing, the right efficiency within our ops department, all the things are working right, the best we typically see is about 25% of an hour's worth of labor is going to go to the bottom line. In this case, we could say, hey, we'll make about 170 bucks. Here's the question that I wanted to ask you guys. How can we increase profitability but without touching that rate? 150 bucks is going to stay. We're not going to try to raise the rate. Is there any way for us to make any additional profitability on a deal such as this, if we're using an example? If anybody wants to take themselves off mute, what would you say? I'd like to hear a couple of suggestions of how do we make more money without touching that hourly rate. So Mauricio, I think you came off mute. Did you want to say something?
I mean, being efficient in front of the customer, reducing the time we spend at the site.
Okay.
Yeah,
You're charging by the
gotta-
hour though.
Oh,
So if you're more efficient, wouldn't you bill less?
mm,
You gotta
Yeah.
lower your costs.
Yeah. You could lower costs, but the question becomes where? How do we lower cost if we're billing by the hour? Because if we're spending an hour, we still have to pay the same amount. So I think you guys are getting there. Does there anybody else have a suggestion of what is the possible way that we can make a little additional profit without changing that rate? Does anybody have a guess? I think
and
you're both on the right track.
selling something additionally,
Billing, what's that?
selling something else with it, like
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, I mean, those
bundling
cross-selling
together.
still potential as well. Well, that's what I wanted to get into today, because there's really 3 legs to the stool when we're talking about hourly profitability. And I'm going to come back to this example. I'm going to explain what I mean here, and then we'll come back and I'll show you how we do it. What do we can control? Remember we asked that. Well, we can obviously control the rate we charge for our services. But we can also control 2 other things that really do have a very big effect on profitability. And that is our billing increments. What increments do we use? Do we bill in 6-minute increments, which is 1/10 of an hour? Do we bill in 15-minute increments? Do we bill 30 or 60-minute increments? If I have a service call or a project that takes 1 hour and 20 minutes to complete, am I going to bill the customer an hour and a half? Or let's say it's an hour and 15 minutes. Am I going to bill the customer an hour and 15 minutes is how much it actually took? Will I bill an hour and 15 minutes? If I have 30-minute increments for that same job, I am going to bill an hour and 30 minutes. If I do 1 hour increments, I'm going to bill 2 hours. We'll get into why and how that works, but that's almost as important as the rate we charge is the billing increments. The other 3rd leg of the stool that I like to say is the minimum billable time. This is more along the lines of when we have folks that are billable service customers that have small service calls that are 15 minutes to an hour. If we have to roll a truck, we definitely want to have a minimum billable time. But we also want to consider this when we do remote remediation, where we don't roll a truck. Because let's put it this way. I bring this up because I've had a lot of folks in the IT business and the voice business who say, yeah, we do managed services, but we also have some customers that are on break fix. They call up, they have an issue, they email me. It takes 33 minutes to resolve, or on average, let's say. And they say, we bill a 1 hour minimum if I roll a truck and have to go to their site. But if it's a call in, I just bill them 30-minute minimum. Why would we do that? Let's put it this way. I have the same scenario. My network is down. I call in and let's say I tell the customer, hey, we can roll a truck out there and it's going to be an hour minimum. That's $150 plus a $50 trip charge. It'll be $200 for me to come out. And oh, by the way, all my techs are out right now. I know you have an emergency. We'll probably not be able to get you someone until 4 or 5 o'clock today. And me as the business owner, what do I say? $200? Okay, fine, no problem. Just get them out here. My whole network's down. My phone system is down. My customers can't call me, whatever it is. The value to me is $200, is it not? I have an emergency. I'm down. I don't have a service plan. Please come out here and fix my widget. Or here's the other thing. How about this, Mr. Customer? I can fix it remotely. I can get in and reboot whatever needs to be rebooted. I can fix some configurations, whatever I need to do. I can do it remotely. And how much am I going to bill you for that? I can fix it right now and not make you wait 6 or 7 hours for my tech to get there. I'm going to fix it immediately. And I'm also going to charge you $75 for half an hour service time, because if you called in and I can fix it remotely, and because I didn't roll a truck, I am not going to charge you a trip charge. Instead of getting $200, I'm going to get $75. And which one of those do you think is more valuable to the customer? Would you rather have it fixed now or at 4 o'clock? You want to be down all day and all your customers, basically you're dead in the water, you're going to lose a day's worth of revenues in whatever business you're in. Or I can fix it right now and you'll be back up and running in 30 minutes or less. I would choose that option, would you not? And the value to the customer should be worth the same, $200, you would think, if not more, from a value perspective. We make the problem here is, why do we do that? Why do we bill less for remotes? We don't want to, because we're doing it quicker, better, faster, and the value to the customer is the same or more by doing that. And the reason why we tend to do it is because we get stuck in our own heads where we price up from cost rather than from market, down from market instead of up from our costs. We perceive that, oh, our costs are lower, so we can charge less. But think of it this way. What's the value to the customer? If they would have no hesitation to pay $200 and wait 6 hours for you to get out there to fix their widget, would they not be even more satisfied to pay $200 to fix it in the next 30 minutes? Now, I'm not saying we should charge a trip charge for remote, but we should at least charge the same that we would charge from an hourly perspective if we were to roll a truck out there. These things that we're talking about right now, the billing minimums, the increments of billable hours, and the utilizing of trip charges is as impactful or even more impactful than increasing your hourly rate. Our recommendation here, before I get back to our example, I'm going to show you how this works. Our recommendation is we need to absolutely bill at least a 1 hour minimum charge for anything that is hourly. Now, there's some difference between project work and remediation, but not a lot. Sometimes we're going to be a little more careful with the folks that, let's say we're bringing on an MSP customer. That might be treated a little differently than someone who's just billing because the phone system or the IT relationship we have is simply, I pay by the hour when I need you and I don't want to pay anything else. You're going to treat them potentially a little differently because we always do want the recurring. But if we're going to do hourly labor, let's make sure we maximize what our profitability will be. We want to bill at least a 1 hour minimum. We're going to bill a half hour or 1 hour increments. I'd say minimum 30-minute increments. And the folks that are doing very, very well have told themselves, hey, look, I want everybody on a contract. I don't really want to do much in the way of break fix, but if I do break fix, hey, guess what? It's a 2 hour minimum and it's 1 hour increments, period. They are okay if there's someone cheaper in town because they're in a position where they say, hey, we're profitable. This isn't really business that we want in break fix. Talking about project labor, we want to make sure we do roughly the same, but obviously we have some considerations because these are contracted customers. And then if we're doing any remote break fix work, we want to bill the same 1 hour minimum for remote work as we would if we roll the truck. Let's get back to our question. What did I ask a minute ago? I asked, hey, how do we increase our profitability without increasing the hourly rate? And by utilizing these techniques here, you can essentially bill more. And that's an easy thing to say. Is like, yeah, you can be more profitable if you're able to bill more, but you're able to bill more without technically increasing the hourly rate we're charging. So if we bill it in 60-minute increments is our standard, what are we going to make? Well, we'll have another $75 in revenue, would we not? So instead of billing $675 for 4.5 hours, we are going to bill the customer for the spin up of the 3 PCs, and we will bill them for 5 hours. And so we are going to make $75 more. All right, what's a half hour's worth of revenue? Maybe it doesn't sound like a lot, but that is 11% more revenue. Where I come from, if we can increase revenue by 10 or 11%, that's not unsubstantial when you're selling thousands of hours potentially a year in project revenue and hourly labor and break fix hourly labor. But what is the impact to this from a profit perspective? Well, guess what? All the costs in cost of goods, all the costs in sales expense, and all the costs in overhead are going to remain the same. The original profit we would have made on this is about 170. We're going to make 245 because that 75 has nowhere else to go but the bottom line. Might be a couple of dollars in additional expense if this was a commissionable sales for the salesperson, but let's just put that aside. That's really immaterial at this point. But you think of it this way, just by getting that extra half hour, we just increased our profit by 44%. That's a big impact. That's 44% more money than if we would have just billed it in 30-minute increments. What if on top of that, we added a small trip charge? And I'm talking like, typically we bill about a third of an hour. What if we were to add a $40 trip charge to this because we have to go out and we're going to do that on site? That's a standard in the industry. It's been done in IT for decades. It's been done in voice for decades. And it's essentially a way, initially, that it was thought to offset your cost of travel. And it's a standard way to make sure that you're maximizing revenue in that regard. So let's just say we were to bill the 4.5 hours. What if we change that? We're actually billing in 60-minute increments. So we're going to bill 5 hours plus, because whenever we roll, we're going to charge a trip charge of, let's say, very minimal, like $40. Well, now you have $790 in revenue. That's 17% more revenue hitting your top line. And that goes directly to the bottom line because the technicians cost the same, the ops management costs the same. Everything is going to be exactly the same. If we sell that hour of labor, we're just getting a little more money. So that money is going to go directly to the bottom line in profit, and we're going to have roughly 2/3 more money than if we just build it at $150 an hour for 4.5 hours rather than 5 and without a trip charge. That is really important that we understand. This is not small dollars we're talking about. When we have done some analysis, we had folks that were billing 15 increments for small help desk calls for folks who were billable. And this is remote work. And they increased that to 30-minute minimum billing time. And what they were able to do is to take those calls that would typically bill out at a quarter of an hour, and they would double the revenue on every single one of those calls. And that translated for these folks who were doing 4 or 5 of these a day. They had a significant business. And we were just looking at the number of calls that were 15 minutes or less. And then they build them at 30 minutes now. And if they were doing 4 or 5 a day, that's 30, 5 a day would be 30 a week. Multiply that out by 52 weeks a year, and let's say $130 an hour billing rate, and the difference in revenue came to about $30,000. It's the same number of calls. You don't have to find new customers. It translated, that small change translated into $30,000 of annual profit. I always encourage you to look at it from a profit perspective. How much money did you make last year as a company in EBITDA? And if you added $30,000 to it, I guarantee for most of us, that would be a fair percentage increase in profit. You have to be earning an awful lot for 30,000 not to sound like a reasonable number. We've got a whole lot of tag members that are grossing, well, I should say netting in profitability $200,000 to $400,000 a year. After all said and done, after owner salary and overhead and everything, if you're grossing $300,000 a year and you add $30,000 just by making a change like this, you just added 10% to your profitability without lifting a finger. Nothing else, no cost changed, and you didn't have to go out and sell more to your customers. Billing process is super important, and how we do that is just as important as the rate we charge. When it comes to trip charges, we basically recommend this. If we're going to roll a truck anywhere, we would recommend charging a trip charge. If it's project work in the IT space, if it's rolling a truck to go out and do any sort of remediation, if you roll a truck, charge a trip charge. You can always waive it if a customer really complains about it, but typically most folks understand that, and they will absolutely be okay with it in most cases. So is there any hesitation in how we would do this? Does anybody feel like there would be any kind of backlash from their customers if they were to go from a 15-minute increment to a 30-minute increment? Do you think your customers would notice? And would they call and complain? Would you expect to get any kind of dramatic resistance on this? Does anybody have a thought as to whether or not this would be painful?
Hey Tim, this is Blake. Yeah. The only pain I could see with that is for customers that we've done a lot of project work for most of our customers in the past and have not billed a trip charge. So if we started doing that, I could see a little pushback, but that would just be a conversation we'd have to say it's a new policy,
Right.
We just decided to implement it, and then approach that on a case-by-case basis, just based on who starts screaming.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have certain folks, this may work for all your customers and certainly new customers. When you bill out, putting a trip charge in there, kind of quietly changing your billing increments from 15 minutes to 30-minute increments, or going from 30 to 60, which is what the most profitable members in TAG do, have all moved to 60-minute increments. You don't have to jump there right now, but they typically do 3 things. They implement a trip charge, they increase the billing increment. If they're at 15 minutes, they'll go to 30 and then give it a year or 2 before they even consider going to 60. And then they do a third thing, which is to increase their rates at least a small amount once a year. Going from 125 to 130 even is you're probably not going to get a phone call on it. Now, if you have a super large, big customer, one of your whales that's a significant portion of your revenue, and you bill a ton of stuff to them, we would say you probably want to maybe grandfather them in, maybe not raise their rates if you think that it's going to be painful. If you've got a customer who's already trying to negotiate their rates down, coming back at them a month later and saying you're raising them is probably not a good idea. But for the most part, your customers won't notice. We're not going to necessarily call them or send them a letter saying, hey, effective January 1st, our new rates are X. A lot of folks are inclined to do that. We typically do not recommend punching the customer in the face with, hey, I'm going to charge you more come January 1st. If it's significant, then you may want to pull your larger clients aside, give them a phone call, or let them know so they have a heads up. Your key accounts, would you let them know ahead of time? Absolutely. Your other accounts going rate changes, and again, we're going to talk a little bit more about rates on the next class of how we get there, how we raise them, and how we manage the technician cost that goes into providing that hour of labor. But we typically raise rates, and we typically would not get too many phone calls. If you have a customer who calls up and wants to complain about their rate going from 120 to 130 or 150 to 160, we have a whole process of how would you manage that? How would you have accounting who takes that call handle it? And we'll talk about that. And the fear is, why don't we raise our rates? Because I do have TAG members that come into TAG that have not raised their rates in 5 or 6, or I had one that said 8 years. In 2018, they said they basically hadn't raised their rates since 2010 because their competition or their perception of the competition is that I can't get any more than that. Their costs have gone up, but they've not raised their rates. And it's fun because I can kind of go around the room and point to other TAG members that have had that same impression and ask them, okay, in the last 4 years, how many times have you raised their rates? Most of them will say 2 or 3 at least. We encourage you to at least examine your rates once a year. Sometimes you may choose, we're not going to do an increase just yet, let's wait. But if you examine it, have the conversation. All these people that have raised their rates, we have a whole process where if you get anybody complaining, here's how to handle it. But I'll go around the room and I'll say, when you last raised your rates, what'd you do? You know, you went from 120 to 135 a year ago. How many calls did you get? And I'll say, Courtney, how many calls did you get? Courtney might say, none. I would go to Mauricio.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, we did that. We hadn't raised our rates in a long time. We raised our remote rates from 120 to 160 to match our on-site. I didn't get a single phone call. And then we just October 1st raised from 160 across the board to 180, and so far haven't gotten a single call. The only people that complain are the people that complain no matter what your rate is. They're just complaining because we're billing them.
Right, exactly. You know,
I just tell them that we're happy to sign them up for a partner program and push them to sales.
Yeah, exactly. You know, and that's why as we become more profitable, we get to be a little more commanding in what kind of business we want. I'll use Kelly Ethington, who's our most profitable TAG member. She's in Sparta, Illinois, an office that I was in last week when we had our last call, and it's very rural Illinois, maybe an hour and a half from St. Louis, cornfields and horse farms and a couple of stoplights in their town. But they get over $200 an hour. They're going to do on-site work. They have a minimum 2-hour billing, and they charge a trip charge, and they do 1-hour increments above 2 hours. This is not like the commanding high rates of a New York or Chicago or Los Angeles. This is a rural America, and they're able to do that. And the reason why they're able to do that is because they don't want the business all that bad, because these are all for them customers who have rejected being on a partner plan or not really wanted to be on an MSP program. They say, well, can we call you when we need IT help? We just want to pay by the hour when we need you. And they don't want that business that much. They want to have those folks on a partner plan. So what do? They actually say, okay, well, if you want to do it that way, there's our rates. So they have a commanding leverage of, if you don't want to be on a partner plan, we're going to charge you what makes sense to us. Otherwise, it's not worth our time. Now, not everybody's in that position. They're very profitable, so they can certainly pick and choose how they want to do business, because it's not terribly material to them. But for most of us, all revenue is good revenue. If an hourly rate is $150 an hour, we'll do whatever it takes to earn that 150 hours. If somebody said, I'll pay you $150 an hour to bake me a birthday cake, typically we're just going to ask them what flavor they want. We're going to do it, because all revenue is good revenue. We'll take anything and everything that will come through the door. And we're hesitant sometimes to manipulate our rates a little bit because we're afraid that we're going to lose business. And we don't want to be that way. And we can show you example after example after example. And Courtney, thank you, because that's precisely what we see in our financial class when we do it in person. Is there's folks that are taking the class for the second or third time that have took it 5 years ago, took it 2 years ago, and come back because we're always changing it. And they say, this conversation on rates, I was skeptical, but I raised my rates, and I was ready for this deluge of complaining customers and people going to call someone else, and I'm going to lose customers. And I didn't get one phone call. And that's typically been the norm. And obviously, what you said, Courtney, is it's for every single one in the 6.5 years I've been with TAG, where we've talked to folks that have raised their rates. I've asked every single one, how many calls did you get? 100% of the time, it's 0 or 1. I've never had anybody say that they've had more calls than that, and I've never had anybody say that they lost a customer over it that they didn't really want to lose anyway. When you're billing by the hour, you're typically going to have more complaints because these are extra bills. It's like, oh, wait a minute. What do you mean it's $675 for this emergency service call? Oh, well, sorry, you're not on the partner plan, right? So
Yeah, I think
these
the
are all
biggest
things
complaint we get is
very
the
good.
yeah.
Go
I
ahead.
think if somebody has a 5 or 10 hour or 5 or 10 minute remote and we charge them an hour, that's probably the biggest complaint we get.
Yeah, and you will get those. And there's sometimes some accommodation for if it's a 90-second password reset, are we going to bill them for a full hour? Well, maybe not. But a lot of times when the bill comes, you get from an IT perspective, we get an email or a phone call potentially. The customer gets billed. They may not know how much time we spent on it. We may have been researching the issue. We may have logged in to check let's look at the server, look what's happening. And then we call them to work on it. When we bill them, they may say, well, we were on the phone for 10 minutes. They may not know that we were spending 20 minutes before that looking at the issue, researching it, trying to figure out what was wrong before we call you to try to have you fix it. So that's the other thing too, is our customers don't always know exactly how much time we've spent to resolve their issue. So that makes it a little bit easier to tolerate folks that have questions like that. Project work, we want to be certainly careful and fair, but if we have a policy of it's going to be round 1 hour increments, if we estimate that it's going to take 4 to 4.5 hours, we would probably, in actual time, we would probably provide an estimate to the customer saying, hey, yeah, to spin up these PCs or install the server, we'd probably provide them an estimate of 5 hours. We would try to estimate the way we plan to bill it, rather than telling the customer it would be 4 hours and 20 minutes or something like that. We would want to estimate it with the customer in the same manner that we would plan to bill it. And if we think it'll be somewhere north of 4 hours, we certainly want to provide an initial estimate to the customer of 5, because that's what we would expect to bill if we're going to round up to the next hour. And ultimately, the better you get at providing managed services or partner plans on the voice side and surveillance side, the T&M type customer becomes less and less important because it's a smaller piece of your business. If you do 60% of your revenue on a billable hourly basis, you have to be careful. But as you grow your recurring, those break fix type customers don't become as important anymore, and you can choose to, hey, this isn't the business we really want to be in. We'll do it, but this is our rates and this is our policy. And if you want us to do it this way, we'll do it. But we're going to do it on our terms. Project work, if you're getting an MSP contract out of it, be fair. But if you have a policy of round hours, use it. If you want to not charge a trip charge to existing customers that have never had one, we would say maybe test it out. Why don't you try it, especially at a point when, let's say, if you have a spike in gas prices, you can always point to that, of starting to bill a few of those, not with customers you think might be truly insulted by it. Bill it and see what happens. Because here's the thing, if they call you up and they say, what's the deal with this trip charge? You can say, oh gosh, I'm sorry. I always say this, you didn't get our letter. We were going to be having to do this because of the increasing costs on our side. You're not really lying because you never sent a letter necessarily, but you're saying you did not get a letter and I'm going to waive it. I'm going to waive that trip charge. No problem. Initially, that's how you handle it. Just, oh, I'm sorry, you were not aware. I'm going to take it off today, done. First thing I want to know though, is did my technician fully satisfy your issue, fully resolve your issue? Are you completely satisfied with the work they did first? Because if not, I'm going to rip up the bill altogether. Okay, great. The rates went up or the trip charge is on there. You're satisfied. Okay, I'm going to take that off, or I'm going to charge you the old rate. But this is something we have to do. So next time, this is something we would bill on the next one. And most everybody would say, gosh, that's okay. Thank you. They'll be happy. You immediately take off the bill. Immediately just say, you weren't aware, I'm taking it off. If you get that call, there's certainly ways like that to resolve it, that in a way that the customer will be satisfied because you're reducing their bill, but then also know that that's going to be the new rate or the new trip charge going forward. In terms of trip charges, I would say try billing it and see what kind of reaction you get. Ultimately, if you have to roll a truck, roll a truck. I'm going to stop it there because we got 4 or 5 minutes left, and I'm going to get into the rates and how we maximize the rate. We already talked a little bit about it. I'm going to get into the technician efficiency and how we manage those costs, make sure we manage costs on the delivery side. And we'll talk about the standalone equipment sales, which is all part of the same topic, in our next session. And then after that, we're going to start getting into core recurring revenues. We're going to get into IT. So every one of these classes is probably going to touch on a slightly more dynamic topic. But I'll leave it there. What are your questions? Do you have any before we break in about 4 or 5 minutes? Any questions on rates or increments, any of that stuff, or how you manage it?
Tim, I have a question. It's Penny.
Hi,
What
Penny.
do you see as the standard for after-hour minimums? Like, we do a 2-hour minimum after hour right now, but it's been like that probably for 20 years.
Yeah. What's your minimum during regular hours?
1 hour.
Gotcha. For after hours, like nights and weekends, everybody's got a little different way of doing it. I don't know if there's a real standard. I mean, the thing you want to make sure that you're doing is every single one of those calls typically is going to involve overtime, because your technicians are already working a 40-hour week. So if they get up on a Saturday and have to run out for an emergency, you're paying that technician time and a half. Typically, you would want to have either a minimum that covers it, a surcharge on the rate potentially. Like those are the two things I see. If you have a minimum, it just depends on, okay, if it's an hour and you have a 2-hour minimum, you're probably fine. But if it's a 2-hour minimum and you spend 3 hours, then it doesn't get you any extra money. So you're paying time and a half to the technician while you're still getting your normal regular rate. So you're eating the difference essentially. So
Yeah.
what I see typically is a rate surcharge just to cover the OT, and it doesn't have to be egregious. It doesn't have to be time and a half on your rate. Like, you're not going to take $150 and charge $225. But if it's after hours, I would recommend at least charging $180 to $200 so that you're covering that additional time that you're paying the technician. I would just say for these after hours or weekend work, if the vast majority is sub 2 hours, you're probably fine.
Okay.
we
Yeah,
do,
I should have
or-
said that we do charge OT. So it's minimum 2 hours OT. Time and a half.
Yep.
we do Sundays and holidays. We'll do 4-hour minimums, but do, like you were just saying, the time and a half for, nights and Saturdays.
That's good
Yeah.
to know.
We're going on site.
Well, and when we look at this, there's a lot of ways to kind of skin that cat. As long as you're covering the additional cost to deliver it, you're probably fine. Typically, we don't get a lot of them. So if you look at a year's worth of time and material billing, and you think, how many hours did we bill by the hour for project work and remediation by the hour for any of these other disciplines? We look at all the hours we bill, in the thousands typically. How many hours were nights and weekends? 15, 20, 50. Typically, there's not a ton. So have a policy to recoup your costs, but also realize that if you look at your entire business over the course of the year, in this regard. It's not terribly material. Like it's not going to make you or break you if you have the right policy for after hours, just because we really don't get that many. So we always want to look at the materiality of it. It's much more important to have the rate at the right place, to have your increments at the right place, billing a trip charge when you can, because that applies to every call. So that's certainly most important. Good topic to bring up, but we always look at it as, in the grand scheme of things, it's certainly less important than making sure we have a robust billing process and hourly rate review annually, 12 to 18 months reviewing rates and making small increases. That makes a huge difference in your bottom line overall. As we just demonstrated, just doing that one call, doing a 5-hour billing plus a trip charge gave us 67% more revenues. You multiply that by all the calls. Let's say if you're able to gain a half hour on most of the projects or billable hours from a remediation standpoint, you're in good shape. It is going to be a material impact to your income on the top line and your profitability on the bottom line. Absolutely. Okay. Any other questions? Mauricio, Blake, Mark? All right.
Good.
Okay. As always, guys, if you think of a question after the fact or a situation at your business that you don't want to necessarily bring into the group, absolutely. If you have any questions, email me after the class, and I'm happy to talk about any of these topics with you one-off. So thank you very much. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Have a happy Thanksgiving, everybody.